It's the first week of February 1955, just 5 months away from Disneyland's grand opening. And while construction is moving fast, something even bigger is happening, because this is the moment when Walt Disney himself starts to transform into a legend. This week, we see a new milestone in the Disneyland construction, an early glimpse at one of the most iconic rides in the park. It's time to step back into 1955, Monday, January 31st to Sunday, February 6th. It's episode 5 of Old Disney News Tonight, covering the 5th week of 1955. Brickey here, your ghost host, bringing you another week of Old Disney News Tonight. Travel back 70 years to see how the Disneyland story was told as it happened. It's Wednesday night in America, the TV is on, the family is gathered, and like clockwork, millions of viewers are turning in to the newest episode of Disneyland. This week, February 2nd, 1955, marked episode 15, and for the first time, audiences were introduced to a character who would become a permanent part of Disneyland's opening day lineup. Critics are raving, the ratings keep climbing, and Walt Disney isn't just a filmmaker anymore, he's becoming a TV star. This week's Disneyland episode, Wind in the Willows, featured 2 Disney shorts, The Reluctant Dragon and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. While these films had already been released in theaters, this was the first time millions of Americans were introduced to Mr. Toad's wild ride through the English countryside. And as we all know, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride will become a permanent Fantasyland attraction when Disneyland opens in July. But Walt's TV show isn't just entertaining families, it's reshaping television itself. Entertainment reporters are obsessed with Disneyland, calling it one of the most important programs in TV history. It's only been on the air 15 times, and it's already being labeled as one of the most important shows in TV history. That is wild. A San Francisco Examiner critic wrote, "Disneyland has become a joy for all ages." The Los Angeles Times went even further, saying, "No show has had a great impact on viewers and the industry as the advent of Disneyland. Even ABC executives can't believe their luck." One broadcasting official said, "You haven't seen anything yet." And apparently, they're right. The marketing strategy behind Disneyland, it's working. Remember when we talked about Disneyland practically begging people to go see 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? Well, ticket sales have skyrocketed. One entertainment executive called it a banana bonanza, saying Walt gave just enough previews to get his audience hungry for more. Walt's theory on using TV to promote films is working like a charm. And at the end of the credits, they're now reminding people films to go see. They are catching on quick to the marketing tool through Disneyland, the TV show. You're seeing it go into the culture. One critic wrote, "A 5-year-old boy saw Treasure Island on Disneyland and begged his parents to buy him the book." Walt isn't just selling movies, he's selling ideas. He's creating demand for products and even future theme park attractions. And the impact? It's unstoppable. Wednesday nights used to be reserved for boxing matches on TV, but now critics say thanks to Disneyland, kids are on their best behavior every Wednesday night. A review from the LA Times even joked, "At least one night a week, Junior has become an angel. He eats whatever we put in front of him. He helps with the dishes. He even lets Dad have his favorite chair." But it all ends at 8:30 p.m., of course. Disneyland is now a top 5 TV show, rising 6 spots in just 1 month. 6 months from now, Disneyland will be a real place. But for now, it's already the biggest thing on TV. And Walt, he's no longer a filmmaker. He's becoming a TV star. While Walt was busy turning television into a marketing powerhouse, over in San Pedro, something legendary was quietly taking shape. Friends, we have official proof. The Mark Twain Riverboat is coming to Disneyland. A newspaper article from this week in 1955 just casually dropped a game-changing detail. But it's not just any boat. It's one of Disneyland's most iconic opening day attractions, still carrying guests around the rivers of America daily. Here's the twist. The legend of the Mark Twain's construction might not be the full story. The version most people know, and the one that I was told, the one about the boat being built at Disney's studios in Burbank, that's only half true, as we're going to learn tonight. An article published February 1st, 1955 states that a 105-foot stern wheel ferry boat is being built at Todd Shipyards in San Pedro, California. While the paper doesn't call it by name, we know exactly what it is. It's the Mark Twain, my favorite ride. For decades, the story of the Mark Twain's construction has been pretty straightforward. Disney engineers built it down the back lot of the studio in Burbank, and then it was transported down to Disneyland, where it would be completed and put together. And now we're learning it's partially true, which is what I love about Old News Tonight. We uncover the full story. But now we have evidence Disney wasn't working alone. Todd Shipyards, one of the most respected shipbuilders in California, was responsible for the actual hull and structural engineering, essentially the real ship underneath all the Disney magic. Walt's team was responsible for all the flourishes, the forced perspective, the ornate railings, the smokestacks, and all that nostalgic charm. That would make the Mark Twain look like something straight out of the 1800s. The Mark Twain wasn't just built at a Disney studio, it was a collaboration between real shipbuilders and Disney Imagineers. Todd Shipyard's relationship with Disney, it doesn't stop here. The same shipyard would later help build Disneyland's fleet of submarines. They also worked on the sailing ship Columbia and won't open up for like another year. The next time you're crossing the Vincent Thomas Bridge, heading west from Long Beach to Palos Verdes, if you look off to your right, you'll see the remains of Todd Shipyards, the birthplace of some of Disneyland's greatest water-based attractions. And speaking of classic misunderstandings, this article calls the Mark Twain a ferry, which as we know, it isn't. Ferries shuttle passengers back and forth across bodies of water. Riverboats, like the Mark Twain, are the attractions themselves. In 1955, the idea of a boat being a ride instead of transportation was unheard of. And as funny as the ferry mistake is, the article makes another even stranger claim. It refers to the rivers of America as a lake. Technically not wrong, but Walt was building a man-made river with a controlled current to feel completely natural. And in just a few months, people are going to see Disney's lake is unlike anything they've ever experienced before. Walt is putting the theme into theme park. As the Mark Twain was being built one piece at a time, it wasn't the only thing that was coming together, because back at Walt Disney Studios, Disneyland was taking over everything. Friends, this week I found one of the biggest Disneyland updates we've ever seen. An article lays out where construction stands in February of 1955. Just 5.5 months from opening, we're only now seeing permits filed for some of the park's biggest attractions. That means they haven't even started building some of these yet. This was also the week 4 cameras were permanently installed to capture time-lapse footage of Disneyland's construction. And those cameras, they're the reason we have so much of the iconic footage of Disneyland being built. Walt knew people would want to see how Disneyland came together. What he probably didn't realize is 70 years later, people would still be watching that footage. This week's first headline came from Anaheim Bulletin, which reported that Disneyland had just been issued $220,000 worth of new construction permits. And if that sounds like a lot of money, well, in today's dollar, that's about $2.4 million. So what's just now starting to get approved? A $70,000 permit for the footings and framework of the Buffeteria, a major restaurant in the park, which I believe the Buffeteria is codename for the Red Wagon Inn. 2 $35,000 permits for the facades of Fantasyland, meaning the castle dark rides aren't built yet. 2 permits totaling $80,000 for the footings and framework of Tomorrowland. So that means that Tomorrowland is currently just dirt with no concrete. And if that wasn't stressful enough, the Opera House on Main Street has officially been converted into a temporary woodworking mill to handle all of the last-minute construction needs. Which makes me wonder, was the Opera House always planned to be the mill, or did they just realize we're losing time going off site, we don't have time to build another structure, we're just going to use the Opera House? And another article I discovered, it also helps explain why we have so much behind the scenes footage of Disneyland in progress. I believe the reporter who wrote this visited Walt Disney Studios while filming next week's episode of Disneyland, a 6-month progress report on the park. So a lot of what he reported on aligns with what you'll see in next week's episode. And that means he describes in this article the props, models, and work in progress were probably the same things that Walt and his team were preparing to showcase on television. But beyond the construction itself, another big headline tells us that Disneyland was still trying to finalize permits for the Disneyland Hotel. That's right, a huge announcement about the Disneyland Hotel 2 weeks ago or 2 episodes ago. They didn't have city approval to build yet. So why announce it before locking down the land? One theory is Disney was trying to control the real estate market. By publicly announcing a $10 million hotel, Disney may have been discouraging other developers from swooping in and grabbing land near the park. Speaking of Disneyland functioning like its own city, Disney also requested a variance to build a super service station at the Winston Street entrance. Now, if you don't know where Winston Street is, well, that's because it doesn't exist anymore. Well, at least not on Disney property. There is a East and West Winston, but the Winston on Disney property, it's long gone. It ran where It's a Small World sits today. And in the opening days of the park, it was their backstage access road. The service station Disney wanted to build, it wasn't for guests. It was for Disneyland's internal vehicle maintenance. This was Disneyland's first step towards operating as a self-sufficient city. Now, let's look at the weirdest part of this week's construction update. In an article by Lincoln Haynes, he makes a wild claim. He writes that the Mark Twain Riverboat, when it sets sail, guests will see alligators snapping at the boat from the water. So my question is, was this bad reporting? Did the writer get confused? Or was there an actual plan to have alligators in the rivers of America? My theory is he got confused between the Jungle Cruise and the rivers of America, but I do like that he reported there would be alligators nipping at the Mark Twain. We know live animals were a part of the original plans for the Jungle Cruise, so who knows? Maybe. But if that wasn't strange enough, the same article predicts a piece of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea would be on display at Disneyland. Now, at this point, in 1955, 20,000 Leagues had nothing to do with Disneyland. But eventually, Tomorrowland needed something, and Disney did, in fact, build a huge display featuring props from the film. Here's one of the last fascinating lines. Haynes describes Disneyland as a permanent World's Fair. That might not seem like that big of a deal now, but 27 years later, in 1982, that would be the exact description that would become the core idea behind Epcot. So the World Fair idea for Disneyland was birthed in this article. But not everyone was thrilled about the way Disneyland was shaping up. This week, we also found the first complaint about Disneyland not selling alcohol. Eventually, only Club 33 served alcohol, but that wouldn't happen until the 60s. And here we are, 70 years later, and Disneyland has started reversing its policy, with drinks now available at multiple locations in the park, but with a little bit of Disney red tape. So it's not like you can just carry booze around Disneyland, but they did break away from Walt's original concept of making it totally family friendly. In this article, you get a sense that Disneyland isn't just a theme park. It's an unstoppable force swallowing up Walt Disney Productions. He describes the studio as a place where everyone seems caught up in Disneyland's whirlwind, from publicists scrambling to promote it to sound stages filled with park props instead of movie sets. At one point, he even questions whether Disney is still a movie studio at all, or if it's transformed into a TV show making a theme park, or a theme park making a TV show. The lines between Hollywood, entertainment, and real-world construction are completely blurred. And as he walks through the studio, he sees artists, model builders, and even makeshift animal sculpting shop. Not for an upcoming film, but for a park that barely exists. The once orderly animation empire of Walt Disney had become something new, a theme park startup racing against the clock. This article shows the hustle and bustle at Walt Disney Productions, that everybody, no matter what their role is, they're now working on Disneyland, meaning the film production has come to a grinding halt because Disneyland is literally taking over everything. In weeks and episodes to come, we'll see that Disneyland starts taking over all of the media attention from Walt Disney Productions. This week we found something truly special, a newspaper article that in just a few paragraphs lays out the legend of Walt Disney. And I don't mean the businessman or the animator, I mean the larger-than-life figure who would go on to define American entertainment for the next century. Because this article, friends, it's like a blueprint. It's the earliest version of the story people will tell about Walt for the next 70 years. And if you've been watching Old Disney News Tonight since the beginning, you'll remember that we saw the first glimpse back in episode 1, when a journalist took a rare look into Walt's personal life. Now, just 1 month later, the narrative is changing. Walt is no longer a man building a theme park. He's becoming something much, much bigger. This week, Bill Henry of the LA Times wrote an article titled Disney's Dream. And as soon as you start reading, you realize this just isn't about Disneyland. This is about Walt himself. Henry describes Walt's patience, his creativity, and his ability to turn dreams into reality, painting a picture of a man who in many ways is becoming a modern American folk hero. But here's what makes this article so interesting, because even though Walt hasn't opened Disneyland yet, Henry is already describing it as an inevitable success. He walks us through the origins of Walt's dream, tracing it back to the late 1930s, when Walt originally wanted to build a small park next to his Burbank studio. But then Henry makes one key observation. Walt's plan only became possible because of one thing that didn't exist back then: television. Henry points out that it was television's endless need for content that would finally give Walt the perfect opportunity to fund Disneyland. And if you've been following along on our series, you know exactly what he's talking about. We've spent the last 4 weeks watching Walt slowly transform television into a marketing machine. And now in this article, it shows us the result of Walt's hard work. Disneyland is no longer a gamble to the public's eye. It's becoming a sure thing. But then Henry shifts his focus to the park itself. And this is where things get interesting, because this is one of the first times we see someone describe Disneyland as something more than just an amusement park. He describes Main Street as a nostalgic time capsule of the gay 90s, Frontierland as a tribute to the Wild West, and Tomorrowland as a glimpse into our future, and the boat ride through the rivers of America as a journey into America's past. Even though Disneyland is still months away from opening, Henry is already placing it into the grand story of America itself. And whether he meant to or not, he just created the framework for how people would describe Disneyland for the next 7 decades. And this is the part that I love, because when Henry talks about what's happening inside of Walt's studio right now, it sounds like something out of a storybook. He describes trains, rocket ships, jungle animals, and even Peter Pan's flight being built under one roof. And then he makes one final observation, that the week after week, Walt is showing these ideas to America. And he's doing it so well that kids across the country are already begging their parents to take them to Disneyland for that magical summer vacation. So just think about this for a second. At this moment in 1955, Disneyland is still half built, and yet the myth of Disneyland is already fully formed. And at the center of it all, Walt Disney, the man who made dreams come true. And if that doesn't sound like the opening lines of every Walt Disney biography ever written, I don't know what does. Friends, if you enjoyed this episode, I promise you next week's show is going to get even bigger, because in just a few days, Walt will finally give America a 6-month progress report on Disneyland. And what's in that report? Well, let's just say a little indication that Disneyland might have to push back that July 15th opening date. We'll be back next week with more Old Disney News Tonight. Same time, same channel, 70 years later.